Perfect. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. I have to say, to my perfect shame, this is my first time in Innsbruck. 4.5 years in Austria and my first time in Innsbruck. So I'm really, really happy to be here. And I'm also happy to share with you the part results of a project that we are just about to finish. And as you will see, this has been a massive data collection project. So we're just now starting sort of to reap all the benefits and to crunch the data and to look at what we've got. So what you're getting is still work in progress. Comments and ideas are very, very welcome. But yeah, to give you an idea what we're working on right now. And I'm doing this with two colleagues, PhD students in the project, Olga Eisele and Lucy Kinski. So, I can't do this from here somehow, can I? Swipe or something? No. All of those taking part in the seminars on legislative studies and parliaments in Europe will be very, very familiar with the whole debate on the famous DemDef. Oh, perfect. The famous DemDef, democratic deficit of the EU, and you will also be familiar with the broad agreement in the literature that national parliaments can somehow play a role in alleviating this deficit. What is also surprising is that there's quite an agreement in the literature on how they should do that, namely, mainly by scrutinizing EU politics and by controlling and influencing their government. That has so far also been sort of the main response from an institutional point of view. Parliaments have been strengthened, have been given more and extensive powers, both domestically and at the EU level. And I don't want to go into too much detail sort of on this background, but I do have a problem with this focus of both the political debate and the academic literature on this influencing function. Because let's not kid ourselves. I mean, national parliaments, even if they have very strong domestic scrutiny and mandating powers, are not going to have a massive impact on EU politics. That's just not happening. EU politics is not made by the Danish Folketing or the Finnish Eduskunta. Does that mean national parliaments are basically irrelevant in this whole thing? And I think it's not the case, quite the opposite. But I think we have to go back to the idea of what are genuine parliamentary functions. We also don't expect parliaments to make policy and to sort of tell the government what to do in domestic politics. We usually don't. We accept that they scrutinize and, in particular, debate government policy and then take the final decision on it. And my argument that I've been making for quite some time is that this is just the same in EU politics, if not more the case. So parliaments have a very, very important role to play, but it is a role which should be mainly focused on the communication function of the EU. So to quote Abraham Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, and I think I did that in the abstract as well, if you think about democratic legitimacy in the EU, it works fairly well with regard to government of the people, government by the people and for the people. Okay, those parts of democratic legitimacy are fairly well established. What doesn't work really well is government of the people. Because government of the people means that citizens have a sense of ownership in a political system, that they take part in political debates and feel part of decisions that are being made, even if they don't agree with them. And I think this is where national parliaments can actually really, really make a difference. They can provide such a sense of ownership for their citizens by communicating EU issues, by communicating what does an upcoming EU proposal mean for domestic interests, what kind of consequences is it going to happen, and then have party political debate on it. that should also never be misunderstood as advertising EU politics or doing the EU's PR work. You know, you can provide this debate and be against Europe or against the European decision, but it needs to be provided. So that just as background, sort of where I'm coming from. So this project that we've been working on for the past 3 years gave me the opportunity to actually look at what are parliaments doing when it comes to their communication function, Öffentlichkeitsarbeit in German. And we not only focus on what parliaments actually do, but we also went one step further. Because how many of you that are participating in this seminar are regularly watching parliamentary TV, reading parliamentary reports on the internet? No? See, I don't either. Because that's not exactly the most fantastic way to spend your free time, is it? Yeah, so you're not going to reach citizens that way. How you reach citizens, or how citizens or people experience politics, is through the media. Unless it happens in Zeit im Bild, or unless it's mentioned or happens in the newspapers, it doesn't happen at all. So this is why we have a second part to the project. And there we look at what are the chances that national parliaments actually reach the citizens through the newspapers. So how much does the press actually report on national parliaments? So those are the two research questions we address. On the one hand, what do they do? And how can we explain that? Patterns that we find. And under what conditions do they actually get any kind of publicity? So we started coding. And we have manually coded. And this is something I don't need to do that quickly again. 10,379 parliamentary activities, and this includes basically, apart from committee meetings, because that data is impossible to get, but that includes everything from oral questions, written questions, hearings, reports, debates, motions of censure, failed motions by the opposition, etc. It just includes everything. And in addition, and we did that for Austria, Germany, Spain, Finland, France, Poland, UK, and we chose those 7 for the usual reasons. On the one hand, they provide us with a good sample of the EU member states in terms of length of membership, size, wealth, east-west, etc., north-south, strong parliament, strong Euroscepticism, and so on. And we did that for 4 years, 2010 to 2013. So a full data collection. We also did the same thing then for newspapers. So for 3 newspapers, 2 quality ones and 1 tabloid, 1 more liberal, left-wing quality one more conservative one. We coded every single article that had anything to do with national parliaments, a national parliamentary actor, an MP, a parliamentary party group, or anything in direct connection to EU politics. And we came up with over 5,800 articles. So we do have a really, really nice data set that we can now look at. So let me tell you just a tiny bit about what we found on what parliaments do so far. As you can see, the number of debates over the 4 years sounds pretty impressive, almost 600 EU debates and 1,200 hours of debate. I mean, they seem to care about the EU a lot, and that's even true for oral questions. Problem is, once you relate that to what they do in other areas, you can see that the outcome isn't all that impressive, actually, when it comes to asking oral questions related to any EU politics. Is actually pretty pitiful. It's under 2%. Debates looks a bit better. It's at least 7%, and these numbers also hide huge differences between the parliaments. So we have some parliaments that debate quite a lot. The Finnish parliament is very active, the German parliament is very active. They come up to over 10 and 14%, while others are even below that. So what have we found out here? One thing we looked at is how over our period of investigation, which clearly sort of is influenced by the fact that it covers the most turbulent time of the Eurozone crisis. So how has growing public and parliamentary contestation affected? How does it affect parliamentary communication? How does it affect what parliaments do? And what we found is that parliaments are indeed responsive to public Euroscepticism. Where they're faced with a Eurosceptic public, they try to communicate more. However, what is even more important is where EU politics are salient, and that's not necessarily the same as Euroscepticism, because you can be just interested in EU politics and find them important, but be pro-EU. This is even more the case. So parliaments in those member states do more. On the other hand, we found that parliamentary contestation itself doesn't really matter very much. It doesn't increase what parliaments do. So one thing we found really surprising is that Eurosceptic parties are much less influential than one would have thought. We thought that those parliaments with large Eurosceptic party groups would be the ones where those groups try to trigger domestic debates because they're the ones that can benefit from it electorally. Turns out that isn't the case. They do quite a lot, but in the other parliaments, the opposition, even pro-European opposition, takes up the slack and does just the same. So that doesn't make a big difference. And something that we expected and found confirmed is that whenever there's a potential for conflict within the coalition, so if coalition parties don't agree on their stance on the European Union, they try to keep it quiet. The greater the differences in the positions, and we use Chapel Hill data, the greater the difference in those positions, the less they do. The more they try to sort of not make EU politics a big topic, because you don't want to air your dirty laundry in public, do you? And finally, I don't know whether you can see that, but all I really want you to get from this slide is that we also had a look at what topics do parliaments debate mainly. And here we can see the massive influence by the crisis, because that first sort of large number of debates on the left side, those are general and institutional matters. So all of the treaty changes or the 135 article amendment, introduction of ESM, EFFS, etc. Then we find a similar huge one where it comes to the EURELEX category that has to do with the economic and monetary union. And we find one at the very right side of the table, which is one that we coded in addition to the EURELEX categories, and that's sort of topics that are, or debates that are self-referential and deal with parliamentary participation rights in EU affairs. So that has been a big topic due to the crisis. So, coming to our project. So, what have we found for the press? And as I said earlier, we have found altogether more than 5,800 articles. Here you find the number for 4 artificial weeks that we created over the 4 years, because we wanted to compare it to the full coverage on EU politics and to the full coverage of the national parliament in all policy areas, sort of to put it into some kind of context. And for that, because we couldn't code everything, we had to create the 4 additional artificial weeks. And so while this at first looks impressive again, so we have 17 articles in Austria, a bit fewer in Finland, rather a bit fewer in France. Germany is quite active, UK is quite active, Poland and Spain somewhere in between. It doesn't look quite so impressive when you put the percentages in. Okay? And what is interesting here are a few cases. So on the one hand, the red line is the percent of EU articles on EU politics that mention the national parliament, a parliamentary activity. And you can see that in most parliaments, it hovers around the 2 or under the 2%. So this is quite disappointing. It's different in the UK, as you can see on the right-hand side, where it suddenly shoots up to 10%. So in 10% of all cases where articles are in EU politics, the House of Commons or MPs do play a role. This is quite impressive, especially if compared to the others. In turn, we find for the percentage of articles that deal with the national parliament, in whatever context, the percentage of those dealing with parliamentary EU politics is a bit higher in all member states, except the UK. But here, the clear outlier is Austria. If you look at the absolute numbers, the Nationalrat doesn't play a big role in the national media. So for Austria, we had the Presse, Standard, and Kronenzeitung. Yeah, they don't really care about MPs or cover the Nationalrat very much. But when they do, then in almost 30% of all cases, it's about EU politics. So quite some differences, and we want to keep hitting the wrong button. Well done. So this is what basically, so those are the difference patterns we found, and this is something we want to explain. And just a few quick words on our theoretical background or theoretical model. It's really a fairly simple and straightforward one. So we come sort of from a rational choice approach, which sees journalists or newspapers as basically goal-oriented actors. Journalists have a lot of goals or aims that they want to fulfill. So they might want to write because they want to be sort of investigative watchdogs of the government. They may want to write because they want to be true chroniclers of politics or the truth. They might also want to write because they, well, not here, but somewhere else, hope to get a Pulitzer, or because they simply want to entertain people. But the precondition for all of that is the one that we draw on, namely that they get readers to consume, i.e. to buy and read their products. So this is the baseline. Now, in order to select stuff to write about and to put in a newspaper, because you all know newspaper has finite space, and there's a lot more happening in the world than fits into the paper. So in order to develop hypotheses on when journalists and editors actually sacrifice some of that scarce space to national parliaments in EU politics, we draw on the very well-known news value approach. So this is, in media studies, this is a really, really well-known concept because it describes sort of what makes an event happening out there in the world worthy to be included in the news. The problem with this is that every article finds additional sets of news values. So there's now an abundance of these news values out there, and we decided to focus on those that most studies agree on and that seem to be the most important, namely relevance for the readers, negativity, and conflicts. This is what gets you in the press. So, quick word on the hypotheses and the independent variables. And if you want to know anything more about the data sources that we draw on, etc., we can do that in Q&A. So, our first assumption was a very straightforward one. Newspapers can only report on what happens. Parliaments don't do anything, it's difficult to report on it. So news supply, what parliaments actually do, so the kinds of activities they undertake, but also the way that they advertise this to the press through press releases, we assumed to matter. Second, we assumed that relevance plays a role. And relevance in this case does refer to parliamentary oversight rights in EU affairs. The more influential a parliament is, the more it may have an impact on the government, and the more it can be assumed to be considered as a relevant actor for the press. We also looked at parliamentary contestation potential, drawing on the news values of conflict and negativity, and again looked at the strength of Eurosceptic party groups that we assume to be interesting and newsworthy actors for the press. And we also looked again at disagreement over EU issues with a coalition, which is in line again with conflict and negativity. We all know if there's a blowout within the government, that's what makes it interesting for the press. And finally, we also look at news values in terms of the readers that the newspapers want to reach. So we assume that newspapers will cater especially to a Eurosceptic audience because they assume that those are actually interested in EU politics. But we also draw, again, on salience, which is independent of the question of whether I'm pro or against. It simply measures of whether people are interested in EU politics. And finally, we add two controls. One of them is the quality paper. Is it a quality paper or not? And the other one is whether it is an election period, because we assume that during election periods, everything else will take a back step. So, getting to the crunching details. What we have is data aggregated at the daily level. So for each single day, we know whether there was an article, what type of article, etc., and we know whether there was not. We have the same for the parliamentary activities, so the full panel set for the 4 years. And then for the aficionados, we have over-dispersed count data. And we have our data that is nested both within the 7 member states, but also within each of the papers. So we do a multi-level negative binomial regression and use paper and country as the intercepts. So what we try to find out in this in the regression is we lag the articles by -1 day. So we want to find out whether there's a connection with something happening in Parliament on one day and the news reporting on the next day. This is the causal connection that we test in this regression, and we test it together with the other independent variables. This is the kind of table you don't use in PowerPoint presentations, which is why I've done this. This gives you slightly less information, but I hope it works. So everything in green is significant and has a positive impact. Everything across all of the models, everything in red is significant and has a negative impact. And to explain the several columns, so we first looked at just all articles. However, articles sometimes just mention that a debate is coming up. For example, it goes on and on and on about the crisis and the EFSS, and then it says, and by the way, the Nationalrat will debate this tomorrow, or has debated this yesterday. And that's different from that debate actually being the main topic of the article. So we coded that and distinguish. Okay, the first one is all. The first big 3 columns are all, and the second column are only those articles where the parliamentary thing is the main topic. And then in the last 2, we do the same only for articles on debates, because debates are the most visible thing that happens in Parliament across all 7. So we look at them in particular. Within those columns, we look at 3 different things. We first look at the different types of activities that happen in Parliament individually. In the second column, we aggregate them to just everything that happens. And in the third one, we draw on the press releases. So now if you look at this, you can see there are two things that are immediately perfectly obvious. And the first one is that the upper half area is remarkably empty. And it's empty because all of those coefficients are insignificant. So if we look at all of the different parliamentary activities, we can see that actually only very, very few have any kind of news value for the press. MPs can issue resolutions, they can ask oral questions, they can send opinions within the political dialogue or the early warning system. No one cares. It doesn't have any impact. What has an impact is debates and failed motions. So if the opposition puts forward a motion and that doesn't get a majority in Parliament, that is also newsworthy. What also has an impact, but we are strongly assuming it's weak, but we're strongly assuming there's an independent variable at play here, an interdependent one, are written questions. Because I just know from reading so many articles that these articles do not mention written questions. So we do have the feeling that maybe issue salience is an intervening variable here, and we still have to test that. So that's the one thing. There's only very, very few things that matter. If we combine them all of the activities, they matter. The more a parliament does, the more active it is, the more publicity it gets. Also, the more aggressively it advertises those activities, the more publicity it gets. So that pays off. The second thing that you can immediately see is that there's rather an absence of significant predictors in the articles on debates columns. So neither are Euroscepticism, salience, etc. is all not really relevant for whether newspapers will report on the day on a debate the next day. What really matters is whether a debate has taken place. That gets reported. The more they debate, the more publicity they get. And what also matters, if there's the potential for conflict in that debate. So our measure of coalition dissent really matters. Also, quality papers report a bit more. But really, those are the only ones that we found to matter for debate articles. And that's true for whether it just mentions the debate in passing or whether it covers it in more detail. Overall, as you can see from the many green thingies in there, sort of our hypotheses were broadly confirmed. One thing that was really surprising was that the size of Eurosceptic party groups has a negative impact. So the greater the parliamentary party group, the less newspapers report. So those coefficients are very, very, very weak. But so we tested this again, especially as salience is also positive, but a lot stronger. Salience matters a lot. Those two, and saw what happens. And actually, in the interaction, it's negative. So why does Euroscepticism matter so little? Why does it not lead to more debates? Not that I can give you a full answer on this, but we looked at it a bit more by calculating marginal effects. So first of all, we looked at, okay, now how do Eurosceptic parties matter over sort of the different size of them? And you can see that, I hope you, can you see that? Well, otherwise I'll just explain it in a bit more detail. So if we look at the marginal effects of Eurosceptic parties on all articles, we can see that it only becomes significant at around 10%. So you need to have at least a somewhat sizable Eurosceptic party to actually have any impact at all. From then on, the impact on the number of articles is negative, but it becomes less negative the greater the party is. So once we arrive at 48%, and here we're talking about the British Conservatives, who are also the party in government, it's almost zero. And it's very, very weak anyway. And the whole effect is even stronger when it comes to articles that cover it as the main topic, because you can see it takes even a greater party size group to be significant, and then the impact is almost not distinguishable from zero. So Eurosceptic parties matter very, very little. Again. And the same is actually true for public Euroscepticism. So here we did the same for Euroscepticism, but we measured the marginal effects of Euroscepticism at different points of salience. And as you can see on the very, very left of that graph, where it just hops over, with the confidence interval, just hops over the zero line, there's a tiny, tiny, tiny positive effect of Euroscepticism on articles. My interpretation is where no one can be bothered, or where basically no one can be bothered with EU politics, there's at least a few Eurosceptics who might be interested in articles, and that's what leads to this tiny increase. Okay? But as soon as the salience of the EU in public opinion crosses a certain threshold, that the impact of Euroscepticism drops. It doesn't matter anymore, or it matters less and less whether the public is Eurosceptic. What matters is they care about the EU. And I think that's a good sign. And you can see that this is even stronger, this effect, when it comes to articles that write about the Parliament in detail, because you can see that from a certain size on, the impact becomes actually completely insignificant. So it doesn't matter at all. So what have we found so far? The news supply by national parliaments matters. It matters what they do. And this also contradicts all of the laments by MPs who say, oh, yeah, we try to do all of this. We try to debate so much. We try to go out there and hold speeches. And we try to reach the public, but no one cares. And the press never cares. That's actually not true. There are a number of activities the press clearly, at least in our parliaments, doesn't seem to care about, but it cares about especially parliamentary debates. So parliaments that want to reach the public need to get EU politics into their plenaries. That's when they will also get greater publicity from the newspapers. That has real news value. What we also see, and this is of course a bit of a problem for national parliaments because this is not something they can necessarily up, but routine is boring. And what sells papers, and this is clearly not just the case with regard to national parliaments, what sells papers is conflict. It's when it's when conflicts happen in Parliament, when people have opposite and hopefully entertaining rows within Parliament. The more conflictual, the better it is for the papers, because then you actually have something to say about. And this is something that others have found as well, that have looked at EU politics in general in national newspapers. They have also found, as long as it was all consensual at the EU level and hardly ever any conflicts, it didn't make it into the national newspapers. As soon as conflicts erupt, and that consensual style is changed into a style where different arguments and interests are pitted against each other, that's when it becomes interesting. Obviously, that is quite a problem for governing parties. Because governing parties, for various PR reasons, have absolutely no interest in airing, as I said, their dirty laundry in public. They also, as we've seen, try to avoid that. The greater the potential for conflict, the less they debate. But of course, it's exactly their dirty laundry that makes them particularly interesting. Now, national governments and governing parties can hardly sort of take the suicidal decision for publicity reasons to have greater conflicts in public. But it is also something we couldn't measure directly, but it's possibly also an indicator that the public wants debates on different standpoints on EU issues. It wants to hear the pros and cons of a European decision. And if they do that, then the newspapers are also helping them and supporting them in that legitimizing role. And finally, as I've shown, parliamentary or public Euroscepticism doesn't increase the media. We still need to look a bit more into that. I can only at this point give you anecdotal evidence. So something we have found, we've started looking into this, but I don't have really good results yet, but something we have found is that the German newspapers, for example, they actually systematically sort of keep the left party, the Linke, sort of outside of their articles. Their share of mentions in the papers is much smaller than their share of the activities in Parliament. So it seems that at least in some member states, sort of newspapers also have a rather pro-European mission, which again would be a problem, because that would mean that they don't fulfill their chronicler role particularly well. And it also means that particular positions on the EU in general, but also on EU politics, systematically or more systematically don't reach the citizens. So we're currently writing on that, but we'll see. Something we've also found for the House of Commons, which is interesting, is the House of Commons quotes MPs a lot, much more than the others. So you find loads of sound bites. Much more sound bites by MPs than you find actual in-depth articles on debates. And who do they select for those sound bites? The hardcore Eurosceptic conservatives. We looked at the top 20 list, and they're all there, starting with Bill Cash, which probably most of you will have heard of. And we also had a look. Most of them, or quite a number of them, have also sort of the X factor. They are top Eurosceptic rebels. So that makes them sexy. You know, they are outspoken, they have clear positions on the EU, they cater to the more Eurosceptic public in the UK, and they're the mavericks. And that makes them interesting. So you come with a well-balanced answer. I mean, academics get that all the time. So we sound incredibly boring in the press because we also try to approach this with a really balanced argument. Yeah, no one's interested in that. So this is what we found. Hope you enjoyed it. And this is it.